Today, an enormous crisis has opened up in U.S. and in fact in world politics. That vacuum is in part defined by the degeneration of the socialist movement, a movement that continues to decline despite the enormous discontent that exists within the working class and the youth. Part of the reason for this degeneration lies in long-term historical reasons. But I'm going to deal with a more recent phenomenon. How the left, socialist and otherwise, has allowed itself to be influenced by, and even at times supported, the fascist-connected Putin. And as an aside, I should just add, some people have asked me why I don't actually refer to Putin as an actual fascist. And the reason is, and I know there's some disagreements on that in my opinion, the Putin regime is not actually fascist. It's just connected with and influenced by and has elements of fascism within it. Putin has built a base through the Russian Orthodox Church and the ideas of what is called traditionalism. That means a return to the old so-called traditions, especially what we know in the U.S. as family values. Central to that has been demonizing LGBTQ plus people. Putin also linked these ideas with support for a return to the old Tsarist Russian Empire. Now, in the U.S. and elsewhere, the so-called anti-imperialist left tends to support whoever opposes U.S. imperialism, not opposition to capitalism itself, just to U.S. imperialism. And through this tendency, Putin has been able to ensnare much of the left in a far-right web. There are historical precedents for this, going all the way back to the German Nazi Gregor Strasser, who combined anti-capitalist rhetoric with anti-Semitism to draw Germans into the Nazi Party. That tendency was called Strasserism. While there are important differences, there are also some important similarities with what Putin and his agents and assets are doing. So I think today, a similar tendency could be called Putinism, hiding behind, quote, opposition to U.S. imperialism, and at times also mixing hints of anti-Semitism. Putinism has brought large sectors of the left, including the socialist left, into this far-right web. So when Putin started to intervene in Syria in 2014, the so-called anti-imperialist left in effect supported not only that intervention, but also the brutal Assad dictatorship. The so-called anti-imperialist left joined all sorts of far-right groups like the British National Party in supporting Assad. We take a break here for you to study the names and the faces of these so-called left Putinists who traveled to Syria as guests of Assad. So to continue on, it wasn't just trips to Syria, it was also similar trips to Russia. A really revealing moment occurred at the 2014 conference in Moscow of the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia, the AGMR. That group was founded and led by a man named Alexander Ionov, and the AGMR conference was about building a base for ethno-nationalism. That means nationalism based around a particular ethnic or ethnic religious group. For example, Jews, that's to say Zionism, or Hindus, Hindutva, Muslims, or Christians of European descent. That is what a nation means to them. The AGMR conference uses the right of nations to self-determination to hide their real ethno-nationalist aims. Ethno-nationalist states with everybody except for the chosen group unwelcome. Major figures of the Putinized left attended, alongside actual fascist, racist groups like the League of the South from the U.S. The Putinized left had no problems rubbing elbows with these types. However, the real coming out party for the Putinization of the left occurred with Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine in 2022. NATO is at fault. Ukraine is full of Nazis, they cried. They were simply channeling Putin's propaganda. In addition to the so-called left supporters and apologists for Russia's invasion, we have a whole college industry of journalists and so-called independent investigators who do the same thing. These types have joined forces with the QAnon-based far-right Republican Party. No less than Mike McCall, the Republican chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Mike Turner, Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee, have said that some of their fellow Republican representatives are spouting Putin propaganda. Take, for instance, this shot of far-right Republican, bigoted Senator Tommy Tuberville. An outgoing Republican Congressman, Ken Buck, called Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is as close to an outright fascist as there is in the U.S. Congress, Moscow Marjorie. Now it is true that the theoretical morass in which socialists have found themselves was fertile soil for this rise of Putinism. But in many cases, these Putinists turned in that direction for the money. Neville Roy Singham is a tech multimillionaire who is connected with the ruling party in China, the Chinese so-called Communist Party. Singham got his start by undermining the rank-and-file base of South Africa's most militant union, the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa, NUMSA. Fashbusters, the anarchist group, first documented that over a 3-year period from 2017 to 2019, Singham had donated over $100 million to a few U.S.-based, quote, left groups. Some of that money went to Code Pink, but the largest amounts went to the People's Forum, which seems to have acted as a distribution center for other groups, first and foremost, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'll give you a few seconds to study this chart. We should pay special attention to the Party of Socialism and Liberation, PSL, which is running Claudia de la Cruz, formerly co-director of the People's Forum, for president. PSL is playing a prominent role in organizing protests against Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. But few people are aware of how PSL is actually a Putinist agent. Here is de la Cruz laughing it up with her fellow Putinists. In the background are a few of the Syrian babies killed by Assad's poison gas attack. De la Cruz and the others let Assad off the hook for that crime. In other words, PSL collaborates with the far-right supporters of Assad and Putin. Now, at the same time, we have Alexander Ionov of the anti-globalization movement of Russia, who has built ties to those on the supposed left, like the so-called African People's Socialist Party and others. Meanwhile, Ionov has financed an agent named Maria Butina to work with the right-wing and racist National Rifle Association. So to summarize before moving on, we can see how, in a very direct way, the agents and assets of Putin have brought what passes for the left and even socialist groups into alignment with the far right. By entangling themselves so closely with the fascist-connected Putin and his agents and assets, this Putinized left has gone too far to reverse course. They have betrayed the most important principles of socialism. Not all are taking money from these sources. Others are simply going along with them to get in with the in-crowd. Opportunism, in other words. But how can one own up to that betrayal when one has actually been taking money from Putin and or his agents? How can one ever admit to that? In the natural world, a species can evolve down a certain road, and when the environment changes, that species must become extinct because it has evolved too far down that road and cannot return. So it is with the evolution of the Putinist, quote, left and their supporters. We must recognize that the Putinist left, those who defend or apologize for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, cannot ever recover. They have betrayed two central principles of socialism. The first is international working class solidarity. The second is recognizing the role of the working class as the subject, not the object of history. And having forgotten about the historic role of the working class, the Putinists go on to ignoring the experience of our class, for example in Iran, Syria, and Ukraine. How can one ever apologize for that butcher Assad without betraying those principles? How can one ever make the slightest apologies for Russia's bloody imperialist invasion of Ukraine without these same betrayals? It is one thing to make a mistake. We all do that. But betrayals like these are a qualitatively different matter. Because of long associations, or simply because it puts us in a minority, it can be painful to recognize this, but recognize that we must. Failing to do so seriously undermines our ability to organize an opposition. It makes it difficult to really play a role as a midwife to the birth of a new socialist movement. Those who insist on trying to retain ties with the Putinized left actually run the risk of acting as a conduit between the Putinists and a new, healthy socialist movement. They can tend to open the door for the Putin apologists to having an influence in the new movement. Reluctance to recognize that the Putin apologists cannot turn back leads to reluctance to accept the necessity of fully exposing them. I say this having seen a series of debates between defenders of Ukraine and the so-called left Putin apologists. I listened to several of these debates and tried to put myself in the position of somebody who just wanted to know more, who didn't really have a defined position. I think I would have come away pretty confused. Here, I have to give some concrete examples in order to be clear. Bill Fletcher Jr. is a prominent defender of Ukraine in the United States. He debated with the Putinist Medea Benjamin. In his debate, he called her a, quote, friend, and he emphasized how much he respected her overall. Presumably, that is because he sees Medea Benjamin as playing a positive role in the future. Now, Medea Benjamin is a supporter of the right-wing Iranian theocracy. Had that been exposed, it would have completely undermined her credibility. But Fletcher couldn't expose that if he considers her to be a friend or wants to work with her in the future. Howie Hawkins, former Green Party's 2020 presidential candidate, debated the Putinist Jill Stein and also at another time Margaret Kimberly. In those debates, Howie refused to expose their real roles. For example, while debating Kimberly, he failed to expose how she had collaborated with the fascists at the 2014 AGMR conference. Today, the anti-globalization movement of Russia, AGMR, features Ahmadinejad of Iran and Assad of Syria as honorable members and features Margaret Kimberly as a strategic partner. Howie also failed to expose how Jill Stein had associated with the fascist-connected Putin and how when she campaigned for president in 2016, she actually supported Trump, whom she called a peace candidate. Since then, Howie has justified this failure in two ways. First, he says he opposes what he calls, quote, ad hominem attacks. But people don't think in rigid categories. When confronted with two different sets of facts, two different versions of history, people tend to just throw up their hands and conclude it's all so complicated I don't know what to think. Maybe there's an element of truth in both sides. But if they see that one side is totally untrustworthy, that plays a major role in what they conclude. Here is an example from my own activity of why it's vital to expose the person that we're debating. I once debated a union bureaucrat in my former union about our going on a wildcat strike against a rotten contract. This bureaucrat claimed he agreed that the contract was no good, but said the strike would be a tactical mistake. He posed as our ally in order to convince us to do nothing. A whole group of rank-and-file members were listening, and I could see that they had become unsure about the matter. Then I pointed out that this same bureaucrat had had a chance to stand up against the contract in the first place, and he'd said nothing. That could be called an ad hominem attack, but it put the icing on the cake. The members completely rejected his arguments. One could say that the bureaucrat's former silence had nothing to do with the validity of his argument, but that's not how people think. We see things as a whole. It's the same with listening to a Putinist like Medea Benjamin or Margaret Kimberly or Jill Stein. Howie explained in a moment of frankness that he didn't want to burn his bridges with Jill Stein or presumably Margaret Kimberly. But if we recognize that the Putinized left cannot play any positive role in rebuilding a left or socialist movement, one based on at least some sector of the working class, then we will not be concerned with burning our bridges with these Putinists. There is also a related issue. It is vital to link up the struggle for Gaza and Palestine with the struggle for Ukraine, and it is also natural. However, most of those who organize the pro-Palestine events do not support Ukraine, although many of the participants of those events would if it were raised. Doing so, of course, would put a speaker in conflict with the others on the podium. So what? It's important. Another Ukraine supporter, Blanca Misset, had exactly that opportunity. She spoke at this Labor for Palestine rally in Oakland. Unfortunately, she did not take advantage of this golden opportunity to make that connection. That was a major mistake, especially because, in my experience, there were many present at that rally who would have really liked that connection had it been mentioned. There are other examples, but before passing on to some other points about perspectives and program, I should also mention the issue of security. This is a very serious and very real issue for those who have family in Ukraine or Syria or Iran. How can they feel secure for those family members if they are in contact with people who have links to the Putinists? They cannot and should not. We who come from the U.S. must not belittle this issue that can mean life and death for others. Now, where does all of this leave us? The Putinization of the left, including the socialist left, is a result of many decades of degeneration. Hopefully it is the final stage in that degeneration. In that case, it means the decks are being cleared for a new, healthy, and working class-based socialist movement to develop. Meanwhile, a huge vacuum is developed. In such circumstances, on rare occasions, a tiny group that ordinarily would be unable to actually affect events can take on a role way beyond what is usual. But that is not the normal course of events. Much more likely is that it will be developments beyond our influence or control, what are called objective developments, that will force a new movement into existence. Here are a couple of examples of such a possible crisis. There are a number of possibilities stemming from the upcoming U.S. elections. One is that the QAnon-based Republicans could overturn the election results in a couple of states, putting Trump in the White House. Another is that they succeed in getting a victory for RFK Jr., that stalking horse for Trump, in one or two states. If that happens, then it's entirely possible that no candidate receives the majority of the votes of the Electoral College, which would make the U.S. House of Representatives pick the next president. Since that majority of states are Republican-controlled, they would automatically pick Trump. In either case, a political explosion could result, one which could get out of control of the NGOs, the union bureaucracy, and similar forces. Another possibility is this. It seems to me that Netanyahu is trying to provoke a wider war with Iran. If he succeeds, Biden will jump in with both feet. A direct war with Iran can have all sorts of global consequences. In my opinion, domestically, it would also probably seal the fate of Biden in the coming election. These are just two of many possibilities in an increasingly volatile world. The overall point is that a new movement of, by, and for at least a sector of the working class is necessary for a wide-scale renewal of the socialist movement. We don't just passively wait for that time. We do what we can to try to build links with the working class and working class youth. We encourage the birth of a new socialist movement. We can do, first and foremost, by trying to unite the struggles against invasion and repression, the struggles conducted by millions of people in Palestine, Ukraine, Syria, Iran, and elsewhere. We have to link that with the struggle against repression in whatever country we live in. In the United States, that means first and foremost the struggle against the Putinist Donald Trump. And in that struggle, we always emphasize the independent role of the working class. There are a few programmatic points we can raise. These include calling for no arms to Israel, send the arms to Ukraine instead, seize the assets of the Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs. These include the assets that have been laundered into real estate investments here in the United States and elsewhere. Build a working class movement to stop Trump and similar figures around the world. Campaigning to unite the struggles goes hand in hand with studying both the recent and more distant history of the working class movement, including its socialist wing. That also includes, by the way, the anarchists. It goes hand in hand with struggling to understand the complex and confusing present situation. There's no way to do that without thoroughly rejecting all of the influences of both Stalinism and Putinism and breaking our ties with the Putinist so-called left, no matter how much that might place us in the minority for the present. We must base ourselves on what has been learned in the past, coupled with the knowledge of that the younger generations are contributing. That is actually a fascinating process. It is what keeps our minds and spirit alive, and it is the method that we must use to play a role in contributing to the building of a new and healthy working class-based socialist movement.